Hello, everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope we're doing well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Joker 2, Joker Folle à les deux, or however the heck it is pronounced, do incredibly bad, especially in the domestic market, where the initial estimates going into the weekend were in the $50 to $60 million range, and the film only ended up getting $40 million. This is after, of course, a terrible word-of-mouth campaign being brought against the film, because the movie ultimately is just not good, especially in comparison to the 2019 film, and especially when you take into account what the message of the film is in its third act, which essentially is just a giant middle finger to anyone that not only was a fan of the first film, but also anyone that is just a fan of Joker in general. I think there's a lot of things to be critical of this movie. There's some things in there that I did actually like in the movie. The musical stuff is actually not even really that bad, all in, when everything is said and done, but the fact still remains, the film not doing well, not holding well either, and I suspect after a very, very, very poor opening weekend in comparison to the estimates going into the weekend, this film will probably have a catastrophic drop-off in week 2. Now, it must be said that the international numbers for this movie actually came in just about where people expected, just about within the range of what was being expected. And so, could the international end up bailing this movie out in the long run? Honestly, I don't think that is going to be the case, but we won't know for sure until we get that second weekend drop-off in the international markets. But we can say is that, especially in comparison to the original from 2019, this film is far, far, far below expectations, far below any projections that could have existed, and can't say I'm all that surprised. All the while, films like The Wild Robot in its second weekend of release had a very strong hold, 48% drop from last weekend, making another $18.7 million. Really, the only thing holding this film back is the fact that it is not the biggest of moneymakers in the world, and that the budget is not the smallest of budgets in the world. But that being said, I think the word of mouth on this movie is absolutely going to be able to push this thing to the edge, push this thing past its break-even point, and be able to bring in some decent profits to boot as well. So let's go ahead and start diving into these stories. So as we mentioned right off the top, we got Joker 2, $40 million. That's around $9,000 per screen. So yeah, this is not good. After about a $7 million Thursday opening premiere, the word of mouth on this thing just completely dropped. I mean, you have, of course, the likes of Tony over at Deadline, who always like to bring up things like the cinema score. Cinema score, as we all know, is complete garbage. But one of the trackings that he does mention, which I do think is worth something, is the post-track. This is through ComScore. And what post-track asks is, again, what do you think about the movie? How do you grade the film? But also, would you give this film a strong recommend, a fair recommend? Like, what exactly is your level of enthusiasm for this movie? And the film got a half star. That's right. Out of, I think, a 4 to 5 star rating system, no matter which one that is, a half star is going to be bad no matter what. It got a half star rating from the people that actually saw it, which means very little people, if any, actually are recommending the movie, let alone liking it themselves, which is why we're seeing this film have a terrible opening weekend, being able to get a $20 million opening day, including the $7 million from previews, and then just drop off a cliff. That's right, $20 million in Thursday to Friday, only to make another $20 million in your Saturday to Sunday numbers. So that's 2 days worth of numbers, equating to essentially just one day. You have those previewed numbers, of course, but that is just from 4 p.m. usually the day before up until 7 p.m., 10 p.m. showings, right, of those premiere things. So usually you have a very large discrepancy, especially on a film that has a very good positive word-of-mouth campaign. You'll have maybe a smaller opening night, right, opening Thursday evening performances, but then you'll have that increase on Friday, increase more, or at least hold well into Saturday and Sunday. This movie is seeing catastrophic level drop-offs, at least in the domestic marketplace. We do not expect this film to make its money back or to make any profit, but the one thing that, as I mentioned, could be said about it is the international numbers not nearly as bad as what we're seeing domestically, but it's still not saying a whole lot. And we'll dive into what the numbers look like as of right now when we get into that charting. The Wild Robot, as I said, and coming in the number 2 spot here, 48% drop after adding about 35 screens, about $4,600 per theater. Again, this film getting a lot of positive praise, positive word of mouth, which makes me very excited for it. I actually have my fall break this weekend, this next week, and so it's one of the films that I plan to see in theaters because, yeah, it's very rare for a film to really have that kind of quality to it these days, where it's like you actually want to see it in a movie theater. This is definitely one of them because of a lot of the praise that's been given to it. So I will get you word back on that about what I think about the movie as soon as I see it, hopefully sometime early this week with my holiday. By the way, thank you everyone out there for your positive thoughts, prayers for my daughter. She had a minor surgery this past Friday, tubes in her ears. Anyone who's had kids, you know that is very common amongst youngsters, and again, she's fine, but obviously it was a day where I needed to have my full attention on her, which is why there was no box office preview. So thank y'all again very much for all your positive vibes and positive prayers and thoughts. So Wild Robot, though, doing very, very well. Beetlejuice also holding very well, a very strong performing film for Warner Brothers. So whereas they have a massive flop in Joker 2, Beetlejuice ended up being a pretty good movie for them. They're continuing to make overall a lot of money from the box office there. $265 million is the current domestic totals for it. And even though the international seems to be doing maybe a little bit better in certain lights, and we'll dive into those numbers. Let me double check that. Sorry, not doing as well. Obviously, this is more of a domestic property. I don't know why I even thought that for a moment. I am just very, very tired today. But $400 million worldwide is why you're seeing this film adding to its overall profits. But definitely could obviously have been a bigger hit, I think, had the film maybe delivered in certain ways. But the fact remains, no matter what I think or what other fans of the franchise might think, or fans of just, Beetlejuice in general might think, there's been a lot of criticism of the story elements of the film. And I'm definitely a part of that criticism for sure. I gave it a decent rating, again, that middle of the road type rating, at least for me, and my own enjoyment level of the film. But I cannot deny the fact there were people in my theater who were laughing, who were having a lot of fun. And clearly, based off of these numbers here, people were going back to see it multiple times over. You don't get to these kinds of numbers in the box office today unless that is actually happening. And sure enough, we can confirm that that is indeed the case for Beetlejuice. Coming in the number 4 spot is Transformers 1 at $5.3 million, dropping another 42% in its third week of release. As I mentioned in last week, this film had a massive drop-off in its last week, 60+% drop-off. And for a film of this type, an animated feature film in this way, with a massive fan base behind it that could have been behind the film, just not showing up for it, this film is expected to be a box office bomb. We'll talk about what the projected losses are for this movie from Paramount. $47 million is currently where it stands, and as you can see, it's already losing over 800 screens after just 3 weeks, showing you that Paramount does not have a lot of confidence in the long-range forecasting for this movie. Coming in the number 5 spot is Speak No Evil, coming back into the top 5 this week, or rather, continuing its reign here at the top 5. I think that the overall adjustments from last weekend, I believe that there was Devara, I believe is the name of the movie, got the number 5 spot in the initial numbers. That must have been brought down from last weekend. And we know that the actual numbers, when they come in, sometimes have that happen. Let's go ahead and actually pull up that last chart. So Devara actually got the number 4 spot. Got the number 4 spot. Speak No Evil took the number 5 spot away from Megalopolis, which of course is just Megaflopolis at this point in time. But hey, this film also continued to hold out pretty well, and I believe it's now available, or at least it was announced for this film to be out on VOD. And so something that typically will hurt the theatrical run for a movie, but I think this movie is definitely doing much better than what anyone could have possibly expected. So that rounds out the top 5 movies. Let's go ahead and dive into some individual releases here. So first off, Joker 2, $121.1 million worldwide. As I mentioned, a much larger international number, and that's really what is the only positive thing to say about this opening weekend. I mean, that $40 million is truly catastrophic. If we just compare this to what Joker 2019's numbers were, these are, of course, are adjusted for inflation to try to keep things as even as possible. That means that as of right now, it had a $20 million opening day. Okay, so Thursday, Friday numbers there, and then it dropped all the way to $11.4 million for its Saturday and an estimated $8 million for its Sunday. When the actuals come out on Monday or Tuesday, guess what? I would not be surprised if this film actually got down, if this film actually ends up in the 30s range. Anywhere in the 30s or low 40s is likely where the final actual numbers will be, because those estimates are usually pretty spot on. But just look at where this compares to the first 3 days of the original Joker 2019. $46 million opening day. So the first Joker film made in its Thursday-Friday premiere, in its Thursday-Friday opening, more than the entire opening domestic weekend for Joker 2. It just gives you an idea of how fans are not showing up for this movie, about how ineffective the trailers were for this movie. But ultimately, I think also it was that 20.6 million versus that 46 million opening day, okay? So you already lost half of your audience. That tells me a lot about the marketing, okay? Because your marketing is supposed to say, hey, fans of the original film, come on back for this one. Let's see if we can get the same level, if not even more, right? Anticipation. Usually sequels are meant to build upon what came before, not just only in story, but also in overall audience. We see this happen, for instance, with a lot of the John Wick movies, where they were able to build their audiences every time, the only exception being the last one. And again, you think about how close that film actually was to the success of some of the other films, and you realize just how impressive that entire franchise actually ultimately is. This, however, is not where you want it to be. You don't want to lose half your audience on your first day. You add on top of that those that did show up on that first day, on that Thursday, Friday, ended up hating the film, or at least most of them hating the film, being critical of it, not recommending it to others. And that's what gets you from 46 in the first film to 38 because of strong word of mouth, because of strong holds, right? You see this natural 46, 38, 28, 20 dropping all the way down to 11, dropping all the way down to 8. And some might say, oh, the percentages aren't too far off from each other. But remember, when we're dealing with percentages from lower overall total values, that is really what the big story is, right? If you're going from $20 to $8 million, that's such a massive difference than from 46 to 28 million. Again, that Sunday alone, $20 million extra was made by the 2019 Joker film. So you add to the fact that that movie was able to leg out to get to around almost $400 million in the domestic marketplace. This film will be lucky, I think, to get to $100 to $150 million domestic. International, that's going to be an interesting story, right? $81.1 million. It's only about a few $1 million away from where the original opening weekend was for Joker in 2019. I think that first opening weekend international for that film was around maybe $86 million or so. I think Nancy, good old Nance over at Deadline has the reporting on that. But I think that the important thing is to note, right, that is obviously a strong performance, or at least a fair performance, a fair hold internationally. Now, as I mentioned before, do I think that this is going to be long-term any good news for the film? Absolutely not. Just like we saw with the domestic market, where that opening weekend was already bad enough, but then that word of mouth hurt it even more. International, I would not be surprised to see a massive drop-off in those week 2 numbers. Again, I think that what we're going to ultimately see is this movie fail in almost every single way to match anywhere close to the success of the first film, and this film would be lucky. It would be a miracle for this film to even get close to half of what the first Joker film did. And I don't think that's going to be a possibility. I don't think that's going to happen. This film needs to make between $500 to $600 million worldwide just to break even. This film will be lucky to get in the $300 million range. And that's just because most films tend to make about 30% of their entire box office, almost about a third of their entire box office on average in their opening weekend alone versus their final and total. So normally if you multiply a film's opening weekend, right, the global opening weekend, just the weekend itself, by about 3 or by 3.3, you typically get to where the film ultimately will end up. If that actually holds up being the case for this movie, that's still going to be just shy of or just at $400 million. That's still an extra $100 to $200 million less than where you need to be just to break even. So we're talking about a movie that's going to lose well over $100 million. There's even a chance for it to be in the $150 million to $200 million loss club when everything is said and done. We'll be tracking that film internationally, especially by the end of next weekend, because, oh boy, yeah, this film set to be a massive flop. Maybe not the biggest flop of the year. That's really the only silver lining for the film, is that it might actually not be the biggest box office flop of the year. But we'll talk about that when we get into the actual charting. So first, let's go on to The Wild Robot. As of right now, I think there might be some internationals that have not updated yet. So do take this number with a slight grain of salt. Again, this is just what the numbers are as the recording of this video, according to thenumbers.com. It's international being reported at $36.4 million, having its total worldwide at around $100 million. Which means if we take that into account of where most films end by the end of their run, right now on paper, it seems that this movie has probably a long ball chance to make its money back and to break even. That being said, I think that you have to look at the overall numbers, right? What does the hold look like currently in the domestic marketplace after its second weekend? It's looking like this film is probably going to double its overall domestic take by the end of its run, just based off of where it is currently tracking. At least that's how it currently seems. Those internationals, I think, are going to be very interesting to see, because as I mentioned, I think we might still be waiting on those films numbers to come out. And also, it does have some money coming from China. Got to be critical of that, always calling that out. But that also means that about 5 million of that 36, that's a pretty sizable portion, right? It's the largest portion internationally, at least according right now to this charting. That is never a good sign, because that is, again, only 25% return for the actual studios themselves. As I mentioned, though, I do think these internationals may not have been actually updated. I'll go ahead and refresh it one more time. So I will have that updated in my charting over on my website, ombreviews.com, for anyone who wants to see what the actual week 2 numbers will look like. But again, just have to say that at this point in time, it's looking okay for that film. But I do think, again, word of mouth is probably going to be what helps save it. Beetlejuice also doing very, very well here. $402 million worldwide. Again, very impressive. Transformers 1 hasn't even cracked $100 million yet. I know that there might be some internationals here that have not also updated either. I know that was the case in previous weeks where I reported on it and people said, well, the actual internationals were pretty good. Again, with a movie like this that cost around $75 million to make, it's only made 1.3 times its budget. It needs to make closer to 2.5 and in many cases 3 times its budget in the market of 2024. It's not looking like that is going to happen anytime in its theatrical release. Speak No Evil at $67.4 million. Again, not the biggest moneymaker in the world, but the fact that it only costs about $15 million to make means this film is a huge box office hit and a huge moneymaker for the studio, 4.5 times its budget, just to give you an idea there. White Bird, haven't heard of this film, but it's based apparently or it's a continuation of part of the story from the film Wonder, which came out several years ago. Wonder was a very, very, very good movie that dealt with a lot of interesting issues as far as bullying. Essentially, there's a kid who has almost like this elephant man type syndrome, and it's just very, very well played. Jacob Tremblay, before he got very well known, or around the same time he was very well known for the film Room, that was able to give Brie Larson her Oscar. He was a phenomenal person, a phenomenal actor in that movie. This apparently is following one of the bullies from the first film and the changes in his life after the courses of the events of that film. And so it's also a faith-based film too. So again, interesting to see this movie. I think it was Alan Ng over on Film Threat who saw the film and actually really liked it a lot. But this film right now, $4.5 million. Hard to say whether or not this film is going to be a hit or not, because it is a much smaller release, only 1,000 screens, so very limited. Won't be able to do much tracking on this film, but we'll maybe keep track on it every now and then when it comes up. $1.3 billion still for Deadpool Wolverine, still doing well. Megaflopolis, that's right, Megaflopolis is the last film I'm talking about here, because as you saw on just the numbers charting, it is not even ranked yet. We're still waiting on all of the films to release their numbers, but this film is yeah. I mean, right now we have 6, 7, 8, number 9 after 2 weeks of release, dropping 74% from its first weekend. Lionsgate is in a lot of trouble. Only $754 per screen. Sorry, $566 per screen, even worse, actually. And it is not looking good for this movie. And this is the reason why I said, whereas Joker is definitely on case and on pace right now to be one of the biggest box office flops of the year, I don't necessarily think it will be the biggest. Let's talk about a couple other things first. So let's go ahead and get this shot a little bit bigger there. We love shotting here over on OMB Reviews. So with Megaflopolis now being recorded as having $7.4 million after 2 weeks, you can project, based off of typical historical standards, the film will probably make between $10 and $14 million by the end of its run. Because it had a $120 million budget, we can project the film will probably end up being a pretty big loss. In fact, I think that these numbers may not even be reflective of the most accurate data and most accurate information available to us, because of just how poorly this thing really is doing, right? The total cost with marketing being around $180 million there. I think it's going to be, again, a lot worse than that for the movie. As you can see right now, $176 million is where the current red is for this movie. So not looking good at all. Not a lot of international numbers being reported yet, so maybe this gets a little bit better when that gets taken into account. But the fact that it is, again, just not doing well by any means indicates for us that things are not looking good for the movie. Let me go ahead and update this in real time, because we do now have some numbers for The Wild Robot. So about $5 million from China. That does have to be taken into account. That means as of right now, it's around $67 million in the red. And because of that fact, I do think that for The Wild Robot, at least, right now the projections are it's going to lose between $30 million or make upwards of 3.5. That is, again, based off of your typical drops. I would not be surprised if this film ends up being a chart breaker, right? Ends up doing better than the typical historical standard. That means doing more than $200 million worldwide by the end of its run. If we are able to get any updates, if the international updates at any point, and that number actually is higher, I think that will actually, just push further why I think that's going to happen. So I think the movie is just pacing too well at this point to not be able to do something like that. It only had a $78 million budget, which, again, ultimately is still quite low in comparison to a lot of other animated films, but still large enough to where it does need to have that kind of run for it to be able to make its money back and also to be able to make some decent profits. I think that in the long run, this film will be a chart breaker, and it will be able to make quite a bit of money at the box office. And as of right now, again, only being $67 million in the red, I do think ultimately will turn out good for this movie. I don't think the same can ultimately be said, though, for a film like the Transformers 1 movie, because whereas Wild Robot is seeing strong holds percentage-wise, week 1 to week 2, is seeing very strong numbers in these different places, Transformers 1 is not. And I think some people said, why is it you're saying in the case of Transformers 1 it's a flop, but in Wild Robot it's not? It all comes down to what is the general sentiment of the movie. Is there positive word of mouth for the film? Is the film holding very strong? And the fact of the matter is Transformers 1 dropped over 60% in its second weekend, while Robot only dropped 48% in its second weekend. So those are very different holds for very different films. And even though you do have a $78 million budget in the case of the first and a $75 million case in the second, again, very similar budgets there, you do see that because of where the films are after 2 weeks of release, that's the reason why you have a $50 to $26 million loss. And we all know, right, using a ×3 multiplier here, that probably will end up being a bit higher than that. While Robot, on the other hand, is in just a much better situation overall. I'd much rather be the Wild Robot right now than Transformers 1. I do not think Transformers 1 is going to make its money. I think it's going to end up being not the biggest flop of the year. I think it'll definitely have a chance to make some money and have some life in its post-theatrical. But where it's tracking right now, I don't see it making its money back while it is still in theaters. While Robot, on the other hand, because of where it's tracking, I do think will be able to do quite well at this point. Let's go ahead and look at Joker's numbers here just to give you an idea of these numbers. And so $121.1 million is currently where it is. And so right now it's at $245 million in the red. So yes, this is still a lot worse than Megaflopolis, but I do think that if those internationals come in and maybe it holds internationally a bit stronger, maybe the international audiences enjoy the film because it's a musical, or enjoy the film because of the way it's telling its story, maybe they're able to enjoy it, whereas people in the United States, people in North America would not enjoy that type of movie and that type of storytelling nearly as much. That could very well happen. And so that's why I'll say I'll hold off my full thoughts until those second weekend numbers actually come out. But I do think that there is still a very, very good chance for this film to end up not being the biggest flop of the year, because you do have massive things like Megaflopolis, right, at $176 million, and it's just not making anything. Single digits versus $121 million. That is, again, a massive difference between the movies. Also, you had Borderlands, which was at $157 million in the red. Fly Me to the Moon at $131 million in the red. $175 million loss for Furiosa. $100+ million for The Fall Guy. I do think that as of right now, $103 million for Madam Web. And also, oh my gosh, I always forget that Argyle was a $255 million loss. So it's already doing better than Argyle as far as just the overall numbers are concerned, but it's still not looking good. Again, I think in a best case scenario, this movie loses $100 million, $150 million, best case scenario at this point. Those international numbers, though, would even then have to be quite strong. And so we'll find that out over the course of the next weekend. But what are y'all's thoughts about these movies and where they're currently standing and how they are doing? Speak No Evil, as I mentioned, is still adding to its profits before it even gets to VOD, or just as it's getting to VOD. So that's going to be good for that. The Substance is a very, very weird, bizarre film that by the end of it, I just thought went way too far with a lot of things. I don't think it's going to make its money back theatrically because it is a much smaller film. But as you can see, we're still in this era of flops. I think Wild Robot will be one of the only ones that will be able to push things into that positive territory and be able to make some money to boot. But what are y'all's thoughts about these movies? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, loud that fire button over in Aussie, and smash the button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Sunday. Thank you very much for dealing with my brain as scattered as it is with all the things going on this weekend. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off first with my people on Patreon, Father Luca Illick and Miss Martin Muses. Check out her YouTube channel by the same name, Miss Martin Muses. Also to my Subscribe Star people, Matt317. Check out his Twitch channel by the same name, Matt317. And also to the K-Man. Check out his website, xtheboundaries.co. And lastly to my YouTube member, Mr. Roy. Shout out to you, good sir. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, check out the top link in the video description below where you get access to that. Also, you get access to a plethora of other things. You get your name listed at the end of every live stream and video, like you saw in those names that came up before this video started. And also access to a giveaways channel that I host over on the Discord server where I give away 4Ks, Steelbooks, Blu-rays, all kinds of stuff. So check that out if you're interested in that. Also, I have an exclusive podcast that I hold at least once a month, and it's always a good time, and you get extra bonus content with that also. So if any of that sounds interesting, again, check out that top link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing, and beautiful people, have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed August, and as always, God bless.